Welcome to the night when trained Marines swore they weren't facing men at all. February 1968. Khe Sanh, a name that still vibrates through the jungle mist. The base sat high on a red clay plateau near Laos, surrounded by ridgelines that swallowed sound. That night the fog came early, crawling low, thick as breath. Outposts along Hill 861 and Hill 558 reported strange echoes on the wire, footsteps that circled but never advanced, voices whispering in English. And then silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums until you feel your pulse in your teeth. At 0213 a flare went up, white hissing burning through the mist, and every man in the trench saw the same impossible thing, shapes moving upright, too tall, too slow, their outlines bleeding into the smoke. One Marine fired. Then another. Then the perimeter erupted, rifles flashing into a wall of fog where nothing ever fell. When daylight came, the clay was pocked with craters and footprints that led nowhere. No bodies, no blood. Just marks in the mud, deep, human-sized, but spaced too far apart to make sense. The official log called it unconfirmed movement. But the men who were there never forgot the sound, the heavy drag, the breath that wasn't theirs, the sudden stillness, as if the earth itself held its breath back. They called them shadows, and after that night, no one volunteered for patrol beyond the wire. One radio operator later wrote in his journal that the static seemed to talk, faint syllables repeating between bursts of white noise, whispering their names in broken cadence. He tore that page out before rotation burned it, and still claimed the ash smelled like rain and cordite. And that's where this story begins, not with strategy or maps or dates, but with what they swore they saw. Men trained to measure distance by rifle sights, suddenly unable to tell what was real. When the letters surfaced decades later, water-stained words fading under mildew, they all carried the same confession. We faced something out there, and it looked back. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and the exact moment you're hearing this. Because sometimes, stories like this don't just echo, they answer. And if you listen close enough tonight, maybe you'll hear what they heard on that ridge, a sound that still moves through the fog at Khe Sanh. February 1968. Quang Tri Province, the farthest outpost before Laos, where the earth turned to rust and the sky never cleared. The 3rd Marine Division held the line at Khe Sanh Combat Base, a remote plateau surrounded by jungle ridges and the haunting echo of distant artillery. The monsoon season had made everything slick mud clinging to boots, rain hissing on helmets, and mist so thick it blurred the world into a dull gray smear. Somewhere beyond that fog was the enemy, or at least that's what the maps insisted. But in the letters and reports, something else moved through the record, something the official archives couldn't explain. They called it Operation Scotland, a defensive stand that would stretch for 77 days, one of the longest sieges in Marine Corps history. The outpost was home to roughly 6,000 men sealed off from the world, except for airlifts and static-filled radio lines. Bunkers of sandbags and timber dotted the ridges, Hill 861, 881 North, 881 South. Names that later became coordinates on the after-action reports, but to the men stationed there they were simply the hills. The fog hung there like memory, swallowing everything it touched. And when the first strange nights began, it didn't come with screams or gunfire. It came quietly, like the jungle was remembering something old. Sergeant William Haynes, 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, wrote home in late January. His letter, recovered years later, begins plainly. It's the quiet that does it. You can hear your own heartbeat between flares. He mentions the insects stopping mid-hum, the wind dying without warning, and the uncanny sensation that the night was listening back. He ends the paragraph with one chilling line. Sometimes I think they're out there already waiting for us to remember. The siege hadn't yet reached its peak. Intelligence briefings talked about divisions massing to the west, the threat of encirclement, the pounding from mortars and rockets. Yet within the wire, a different kind of tension built, one that didn't come from the enemy's guns. Marines spoke of footsteps circling trenches that no patrols could find. In the early morning hours, motion sensors tripped with no heat signatures to follow. One sentry near Hill 558 reported seeing figures that wavered, his exact word, between the light of the flares like smoke trying to stand. His report was dismissed as stress, but a week later, Two other posts filed similar claims. The air at Khe Sanh carried a low vibration, a hum that blended with the sound of distant artillery. It never truly stopped, a continuous rumble beneath the rain. Men started hearing whispers in that frequency, like the voice of the jungle talking through the mud and metal. Sleep came in fragments. Radios crackled with phantom call signs, whole phrases repeating from channels long closed. One corporal assigned to the comms bunker later told a reporter, "The static would shape itself into words if you listened long enough. But war has no patience for superstition." Official briefings at the time made no mention of such details. The reports stuck to facts: enemy strength, supply drops, casualty numbers. Yet the handwritten margins of those same reports, the notes scrawled in pencil by officers and clerks, told another story. Phrases like "no visual, just sound," or "unconfirmed movement." 0400 hours appeared over and over. They weren't tactical errors, they were patterns. The weather worsened through February. Each day blurred into the next: red dust, rain, gunpowder, sleep deprivation. The men began calling the fog the curtain. It was the same phrase in multiple diaries. The curtain rolled in again tonight. Behind that curtain, something moved. Not the enemy, not entirely. The North Vietnamese army was real enough entrenched on the other side of the valley. But there were nights when even the veterans went silent, their eyes fixed on the tree line, where the light refused to fall. A photograph taken by a war correspondent on February 12th shows Hill 861 under flare light, white haze rolling over trenches, figures blurred, almost transparent. The negative was later marked "damaged exposure." But in the contact sheet, the outlines look wrong, stretched, indistinct, as though the film caught motion that wasn't there. The photographer, decades later, refused to talk about it. "You wouldn't believe what light can do," he said in an interview before his death. It remembers. What history remembers of Khe Sanh is the siege, the shelling, the endurance, the valor. But buried beneath that history are the reports that didn't fit the pattern. The patrol that vanished for 3 hours and returned without recollection of where they'd gone. The footprints found in the clay, too deep to be human, leading down into ravines and stopping abruptly. The screams that echoed through the wire, recorded on field tape, but later wiped during archiving. For those who were there, the siege wasn't just a battle of attrition. It was a place where reality shifted, where the familiar laws of distance and sound broke down. Many Marines would later describe the sensation of being watched, even when alone, of hearing their own names whispered from nowhere. Some spoke of lights that shimmered along the ridges like fireflies that didn't blink. Others swore they saw faces in the mist, faces they recognized from their own platoons, even though those men were dead or gone. When the base finally fell silent in April, the logs were consolidated and filed away. But those private letters, the ones mailed before censorship, carried another kind of record. They described nights where the fog pulsed like a living thing, and mornings where the ground seemed rearranged. "It's not the enemy," one wrote, "it's the ground itself that wants us gone." This is the context that history never hears, the moment before the siege became legend. A place where official documents end and human memory begins to fracture. Khe Sanh wasn't only a military engagement. It was a point of collapse between sound and silence, life and echo. And before we go any further, pause for a moment. Listen to whatever room you're in right now. Maybe it's quiet. Maybe you hear the hum of the walls, the faint pulse of something electrical. That sound, that low vibration, it's the same one those men heard through the fog. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what you hear when the world goes still. Because the story of Khe Sanh doesn't just live in the past. It hums on the same frequency, even now, waiting for someone else to listen back. The official accounts would later call it confusion under stress, sensory distortion, fatigue, the mind inventing motion where there was none. But inside the field reports of February 17, 1968, something slips through the formality of military language. One paragraph typed in haste reads, "Unidentified sounds along northern wire. 300 hours, no visual contact, men report. Pacing footsteps matching human stride, then fading abruptly." Another entry from the same night describes radio interference resembling whispered speech, indeterminate origin. Those words survived only because they were typed on carbon copies. The originals, according to the archive log, could not be located. The first hand records from Hill 861 are a patchwork of clarity and disbelief. Corporal Ray Meacham's diary notes how the rain falls in straight lines like it's pinned to the air. He describes a night where he woke to find the trench lights flickering on and off, in rhythm 4 flashes, pause 3 flashes as if signaling. The next morning, the wiring was found severed under 3 inches of mud, no footprints, no tool marks. We joked that the jungle learned Morse, he wrote. The humor fades after that page. His remaining entries turn brief, detached. Still hearing it, like boots in water. No one else moves. Military psychiatrists later interviewed survivors for signs of combat stress. They found exhaustion, paranoia, hallucination terms that explained what could not be measured. Yet what haunts the documents isn't madness, it's precision. The reports mention exact times, exact compass bearings, repeated coordinates where unverified movement appeared for nights on end. One patrol captain marked the same tree line 3 times, then drew a circle around it and wrote, "They know when we're watching." On February 23rd, a team from Bravo Company was sent to reinforce an observation post near the rock quarry sector. Their route crossed a ravine known for flash floods, but the weather that night was clear. They radioed check-in at 1940. Then nothing. Silence until 22:07 when the squad leader's voice cut through the static. "Contact unknown, moving under us." Those were his last words on tape. When the relief team reached the site at dawn, the ravine was untouched, no signs of struggle, no enemy presence. The only trace was a single helmet wedged between 2 roots, its chin strap torn, the metal slick with dew. The name inside had been smudged beyond recognition. The incident was classified under loss probable capture, but there was no record of enemy units in the area. Years later, one of the radio operators admitted he'd heard the transmission too, and that what chilled him most wasn't the words, but the tone. "It didn't sound like he was talking to us," he said. "It sounded like he was answering." Photographic evidence from that week shows Marines standing knee-deep in mist that seems to glow around them. Historians have called it a quirk of film stock or flare reflection, but veterans describe something colder, a temperature drop, before contact breath frosting, even in humid air. "It felt like the jungle exhaled," one wrote in a 1983 oral history. Like whatever was out there didn't need light to see. The official command chronologies mention a spike in misfires and weapon jams during those same nights. Weapons inspected later showed no defects. Ammunition was dry. Mechanics chalked it up to operator error. But within the units, a rumor took hold that the ground itself was drawing power shorting circuits, draining batteries. One night, an entire generator line failed for exactly 13 minutes, every clock frozen at 0113, restarting on its own. Engineers logged it as electrical anomaly, though one lieutenant scribbled beside it. "Everything stops when they pass." Through late February, the siege intensified. Artillery fell daily. The enemy pressed closer, and yet it was the silence between barrages that unnerved the men most. During lulls, faint tapping echoed through the trenches, metal against metal, irregular but deliberate. Some said it came from the abandoned tunnels beneath the base remnants of earlier French fortifications. Others swore it came from outside the wire, like someone answering back with tools that didn't belong. The diary of Staff Sergeant Daniel Pruitt captures the unease with eerie simplicity. "You start thinking maybe we're the ghosts," he wrote. "Maybe this is their ground, and we just borrowed it too long." His last entry, dated March 2nd, reads only, "Heard them singing again. No language I know." The following day, Pruitt's position took a direct hit from mortars. His remains were never identified. Forensic teams later cataloged fragments from that site, twisted metal, melted ration tins, shards of personal gear. One item, a waterproof pouch, contained half a sheet of notebook paper. Most of the ink had bled away, but one sentence was still visible under ultraviolet light. "If you hear your name in the static, don't answer." Such phrases blur the boundary between record and folklore, but every layer of documentation repeats the same cadenced sound, without source signal, without sender. It is as if the battlefield itself became sentient learning to mimic the men who walked upon it. When the siege finally lifted, radio technicians reported one last broadcast from the Khe Sanh frequency, a looping fragment unintelligible, except for a single word drawn out through the noise home. Fact ends where comprehension falters. The surviving paperwork fills boxes in Marine Corps archives, clean, factual, devoid of fear. But between those sterile lines live the traces of something else, transcriptions that hesitate, mid-sentence logs ending in static reports folded over as if someone changed their mind halfway through writing. Whatever happened on those ridges was more than a siege. It was an intersection between men and the memory of the land itself, between sound and silence, between what we know and what still answers back when the night grows too quiet. By March, the siege was no longer measured in days, but in hours of noise, smoke, and the strange gaps between explosions. The men had stopped talking about the shapes in the fog, at least out loud, yet everyone felt them. Hill 861 had become a labyrinth of trenches filled with red mud and stifling air. Every night the perimeter flares hissed into the sky, bathing the ridge in white fire. Beneath that glare, motion sensors blinked green, then red, then nothing at all. The operators swore they could feel the hum of something moving underground, a low vibration that traveled up through their boots, making the sandbags tremble. When dawn came, the trenches always looked slightly different: walls leaning where they shouldn't, new gaps appearing where no shell had landed. It was as if the earth itself was rearranging under them. The rain grew colder. It fell in thin sheets that made breathing difficult, clinging to uniforms, smearing the red dust into a film that never dried. The men were ghosts of themselves, faces, pale eyes, raw from smoke and sleeplessness. They moved automatically, cleaning rifles, checking ammo, writing letters they would never send. Somewhere in that haze, fear had turned ritualistic. They began whispering to the ground before stepping into a new trench, muttering the same 3 words: "Don't wake them." No one remembered who said it first, but the phrase spread through the platoons like a password. Then came the night of March 8th, the night every surviving diary mentions. The shelling had been heavy at dusk, tapering off around midnight. The fog moved in thicker than usual, swallowing the flare light, until the base seemed suspended in a dream. Around 02 Huzur, the radio picked up an open channel, not their frequency, not any frequency they used, just a soft crackle followed by distant breathing. The operator thought it was feedback until a voice whispered through the static, low and steady, "Hold your fire." It was their own call sign, repeated in perfect rhythm, the same tone as their commanding officer, except the colonel was asleep 50 yards away. The recording from that night still exists, though most of it is hiss and distortion. At the 4-minute mark, the voice changes pitch, stretching the words as if someone were pulling them apart. Then underneath another sound, a faint dragging like cloth across gravel. Seconds later, the outpost lights flickered and the perimeter alarms went dead. Patrols reported movement near the wire, dozens of figures advancing slowly upright, visible only as shadows against the mist. The Marines opened fire rounds, vanishing into the fog without impact. The first machine gun jammed after 5 rounds, then another. In the chaos, someone shouted, "They're already inside," but no one knew where inside was. When light finally returned, the wire was intact. No breaches. No footprints except their own. But scattered across the mud were pieces of metal, not shrapnel, but twisted fragments of radio antennae, each one shaped like the arc of a human spine. Engineers dismissed it as debris from a prior blast, but none could explain why the metal was warm to the touch hours after sunrise. Over the following days, exhaustion warped reality. Men began hearing their names whispered from empty corners of bunkers. One private swore he saw his own silhouette cast on the trench wall moving before he did. Another claimed his reflection in the puddles blinked twice when he hadn't. The medical tent filled with men complaining of vertigo, nausea, trembling hands. Command labeled it siege fatigue, prescribing salt tablets and rest. But no one could rest. The jungle was alive with sound, tapping, humming, the echo of faraway footsteps that grew louder when you stopped to listen. On March 11th, Corporal Meacham, the same one who had written about the rain falling in straight lines, vanished during a supply run between Hill 558 and the main base. His unit found his pack half buried at the edge of a bomb crater, radio still transmitting. The last thing it recorded was breathing 2 distinct patterns, one fast, one impossibly slow, drawn out between pulses of static. His squad swore they'd seen him walking ahead only seconds before he disappeared, turning down the path toward the tree line where the fog bent light like glass. That disappearance cracked morale. Men began refusing solo shifts. The trenches filled with whispers. Some said the fog was chemical. Others claimed the ground had absorbed too much blood. A few insisted the base was cursed, built on an older burial site from the First Indochina War, maybe even earlier. The French, they said, had warned the Americans not to build there. One rumor told of a trench found full of bones during the early construction, all facing upward, as if waiting. There was no proof of any of it, just talk, the kind that grows in the dark when logic stops working. A letter recovered from that week, unsigned, reads like confession more than report. We're being watched from underneath. The ground shakes when it's quiet. Sometimes it answers when I breathe. The handwriting falters halfway down the page. The rest of the sheet is blank, water-stained into a spiral, as though pressed by something wet. On March 14th, a photographer embedded with the 26th Marines took a series of long exposure shots from the North Ridge light trails, tracing flare arcs above the base. One frame captures something unintentional along the lower edge of the trench line. Streaks of pale light curve upward, not downward. Analysts later said it was lens error, reversed exposure. But the soldiers who saw the print swore those streaks matched the outline of figures they'd fired at weeks earlier. The photographer never shot at night again. By the final week of March, something shifted. The jungle went still. Mortar fire slowed. Even the enemy, real or imagined, seemed to vanish. One Marine described it as the quiet before the quiet, a silence so complete it hurt. At 03:45 on March 22nd, a massive explosion rocked the southern sector. When the smoke cleared, they found the ammunition dump untouched, but the ground beneath it had collapsed, a perfect circle of mud, sinking 6 feet down as though hollowed from below. No tremors were recorded. No seismic activity reported. The crater filled with water overnight, forming a mirror-smooth pool that reflected nothing above it. Soldiers avoided it instinctively. They said the water didn't ripple even under rain. That was the night the whispers stopped. Radios returned to normal static. The jungle stayed still. But something about the silence was worse than the noise. The fog no longer rolled, it stood motionless like a wall. Every step sounded muffled as if walking underwater. Then came the final anomaly. One of the watchtowers, Tower 3, reported movement at 02:11. The sentry on duty called it in single figure, approaching from south line, no weapon visible. Command ordered flares. The light went up, bleaching the field white. The figure kept walking steady, human-sized, wearing marine fatigues. No one fired. When it reached the wire, the flare light died. Power cut across the base for 7 seconds. When the lights came back, the figure was gone. The sentry who'd reported it was found unconscious, pulse normal, but eyes open, pupils fixed, unresponsive. His last words before being evacuated. It was me. No one ever confirmed what he meant. The incident report labels it stress episode, no external threat. But in the weeks after, soldiers swore they saw that same man's face in reflections in puddles in helmet visors in the glass of the command tent, always turned slightly toward them, always fading before anyone else could see. The siege continued until April. The enemy withdrew, leaving nothing but trenches and the memory of red mud. Official records mark Khe Sanh as a strategic victory. But in every letter, every surviving journal, there's a line no one can explain, that after the final night, the ground felt empty. Not safe, just empty. As if whatever had been watching had finally moved on, leaving only its echo in the fog. And even now, when veterans of Khe Sanh talk about those nights, their voices lower on instinct, as though something might still be listening. When the war historians tried to reconstruct those weeks, they found gaps that couldn't be filled. The radio logs broke mid-entry, some carbon copies missing entirely, others smudged into gray ghosts of letters. Between March 23rd and March 30th, every transmission from Hill 88D1 South registered faint echoes delayed by a fraction of a second, as if bounced off something too close to be sky. Technicians later dismissed it as atmospheric bounce, but the delay was consistent only during hours between midnight and 3 a.m. After sunrise, the signal returned to normal. In those same hours, sentries claimed to see flashes in the valley, not artillery, not flares, lights moving horizontally, gliding just above the jungle canopy, before vanishing in silence. Those who lived through it said the base changed after that. The smell of damp clay never left. Even when fires burned for warmth, the smoke clung low, refusing to rise. Equipment corroded overnight. Compass needles trembled even when placed on solid steel. When the rain stopped, fine white ash drifted down instead, soft enough to look like mist, cold enough to sting the skin. Nobody ever found a source. Then came the retrieval team the men assigned to clear the tunnels left from French construction. They descended at dawn, 6 Marines with flashlights and rope to secure the lowest bunker beneath Hill 558. The last voice on the surface radio logged them at 0632. At 0700, the line cut. The rope remained taut for 10 minutes, then slackened. They were never seen again. When the search detail entered hours later, they found the tunnel flooded to the ceiling, though no rainfall had occurred that morning. One helmet floated up from the black water, its interior coated with something like fine soot. The photograph of that helmet catalogued as Evidence Item 7 was later misfiled under chemical analysis and quietly forgotten. That disappearance marked the breaking point. Command sealed the tunnels, declared them structurally unsound. But rumors moved faster than orders. Some said the team had reached a lower level that wasn't on the maps. Others claimed they'd heard voices through the radio, even after the flood, the sound of men counting backward in perfect unison. After the war, when researchers interviewed surviving officers, they found that nearly all of them paused before speaking of Khe Sanh. One colonel simply said, "We dug too deep into something that wasn't ground." Another refused to sign his testimony, saying that the nights still carried weight in his chest. The folklore that grew among later generations of Marines wasn't about bravery or tactics. It was about the fog that learned to breathe. They called it the curtain, the same name their predecessors had whispered. Vietnamese villagers in the region have their own version of the story. In oral accounts recorded decades later, they speak of Nguoi Kong Hon, the soulless ones who appear in the mist before major storms. Their steps are heavy, their faces blurred, their voices borrowed from the living. Elders tell of a time before the base existed, when the ridge was used for burial soldiers from older wars, bandits, farmers, entire families lost to flood. They say the land remembers every sound it swallows, and when too much blood soaks it, it begins to speak back. Cross-checking the folklore with marine archives reveals uncanny parallels, the same nights of silence, the same hours of humming earth, the same pattern of lights drifting across valleys. The American files call them anomalous radar returns. The Vietnamese stories call them the lanterns of the restless. 2 languages, 1 phenomenon, and between them only the fog. In 1971, a French journalist revisited the ruins. His notes described trenches filled with fine dust that rose when touched and hung suspended like smoke. He recorded a single night of audio, 31 minutes of wind and static punctuated by what sounded like footsteps circling the microphone. When the tape was played back in Paris months later, the footsteps continued 10 seconds after the recorder had stopped. The journalist burned the reel, but not before transcribing one line that surfaced in the playback, "Still here." What began as a siege had become a legend that neither side could own. The military closed its reports with conclusions about weather stress, optical illusion, but every witness agreed on the same feeling, that Khe Sanh was not a place you left. It was a place that left something inside you. Even now, the official memorial plaque on the plateau bears a faint stain beneath the engraved years. It reappears each rainy season, no matter how often it's cleaned. A pale outline shaped like a hand pressed into the metal. Perhaps it is only oxidation. Perhaps not. But the villagers avoid touching it. They say it hums when thunder rolls over the hills, and at night, when the clouds sink low, the air smells again of clay and cordite, just as it did in 1968. As if the ground is reminding anyone who listens, they faced shadows, not men. Years after the siege, when the base had long been reclaimed by vines and silence, a recovery team returned. Not soldiers this time, but surveyors and archivists. They came to map the old trenches, to take soil samples to prove that the stories were only stories. But the first night back on the ridge, their instruments began to fail, compasses spinning slowly, cameras freezing mid-shutter. The team leader, Captain Alvarez, noted in his log, "The fog moves even when there's no wind." He was a rational man trained in physics, yet his handwriting trembles by the third page. The nights at Khe Sanh have a way of folding time. The surveyors said they felt watched from below, not from the tree line. One described a faint vibration under the ground, pulsing like a distant heartbeat. The second morning, their tents were dusted with fine white residue, identical to the ash from 1968 samples. Alvarez ordered tests. Results came back inconclusive. Not pollen, not chemical, not volcanic. Organic, one lab wrote, but unidentifiable. When they unearthed a sealed ammunition box near Hill 558, the air shifted. Inside were papers wrapped in plastic fragments of the original field logs thought destroyed. The first page was dated March 22nd, 1968. The ink had bled, but one phrase was still clear. Contact established. Not enemy. Listening. Beneath it, a line drawn in pencil that faded halfway across the sheet, as if the writer's hand had been pulled away. That discovery reignited the legend. Journalists revisited the site, photographing the overgrown bunkers, the crater that had become a pond. At dusk, the water turned the color of steel. A Vietnamese guide refused to stand near it after sunset. He said the pond was hungry. No one laughed. The team left within 48 hours, abandoning one truck when the battery drained completely, every clock on board frozen at 02:13 a.m. Back in the States, the recovered logs were studied in Washington. Most were too damaged to read, but fragments told a story that didn't fit military order. Mentions of returning call signs of voices repeating coordinates before transmission of heat signatures moving opposite direction to wind. The handwriting alternated between confident and desperate, as if multiple people were writing on the same paper through the same hand. One entry ends with the words, "If they ask where we went, tell them we never left." Years blurred into decades. Veterans aged. Some refused interviews, others spoke only in half phrases. "We thought we were defending ground," one said. Turns out the ground was defending itself. He laughed after that, a dry, joyless sound, and never spoke of it again. The Army historian assigned to compile oral histories noticed that every tape recorded at Khe Sanh had the same low hum beneath the voices. Audio technicians filtered it out as interference, but when played back at half speed, the hum revealed a rhythm, not random noise, but syllabic. 3 beats, then 2. Like breath. In 2005, a small team of filmmakers visited Khe Sanh for a documentary. Their footage, never released publicly, showed fog crawling against gravity, descending from the ridge, upward, slow and deliberate. One cameraman whispered that he could hear someone humming just behind the microphone, though no one else did. The footage ends abruptly at the 40-minute mark with a flash of white. When the camera was recovered, the internal clock displayed a time that hadn't yet occurred. To this day, no official explanation exists. The records are archived under weather anomalies, the soil samples marked pending analysis. But the men who stood on that plateau, both in 1968 and decades later, described the same impossible quiet, the same air thick with memory. When asked if they believed in ghosts, one survivor shook his head. "Not ghosts," he said. "Echoes, the kind that remember what made them." And so Khe Sanh remains half battlefield, half wound. The rain still falls in straight lines, the fog still drifts in slow spirals, and every few years someone claims to hear the radio's hum again, transmitting from a frequency no longer listed. A pulse in the static, a voice repeating a name, always between midnight and 3. Always in the same tone, calm, human, and impossibly close. Time has softened the ridge, but not the sound. Khe Sanh today is quiet, too quiet, for a place that once trembled beneath thunder and breath. The grass has reclaimed the bunkers, the jungle has wrapped itself around the runways like memory sealing a wound. Yet when the mist comes down in late afternoon, the air thickens the same way it did in 1968. Tourists stand at the edge of the old airstrip, cameras raised, waiting for light. And sometimes the photographs come back wrong. Faces, blurred silhouettes, doubled fog, shaped like men still walking through the rain. The villagers don't go up there after dusk. They say the land hums when it's wet, and that the wind carries the voices of those who never found their way home. The locals don't call it cursed, they call it remembering. To them, the soil of Khe Sanh isn't haunted by ghosts, but by unfinished sentences, by stories that were never given endings. When thunder rolls across the hills, they say it isn't the sky speaking, it's the ground exhaling. Historians still argue the facts, the skeptics still insist it was exhaustion, weather, illusion. But the tapes remain. The letters remain. The hum remains. And if you listen to the old recordings, those fragments preserved in the archives, you can still hear the faint pulse beneath the static. It's not feedback, not error. It's breath. Long, slow, patient breath. Every generation finds its own way to explain the unexplainable. Maybe what the Marines met in the fog wasn't supernatural at all. Maybe it was something older, deeper. A memory of violence burned into the soil, replaying itself until someone was finally willing to listen. War leaves its mark in more than bones and iron. It leaves echoes, patterns, repetitions. And some places like Khe Sanh seem to learn how to answer back. If you stand there long enough, you might feel it. The vibration under your boots. The low hum rising through the clay. The sound of something that isn't gone, only quiet. Maybe it's the jungle breathing. Maybe it's the land remembering. Or maybe it's the voices of men who once faced shadows, not men calling across time for anyone who will hear them. And so the ridge waits, shrouded, patient, unblinking. The fog rolls, the silence deepens, and the world moves on above it. But the frequency never dies. The signal is still there, waiting for the right receiver, the right moment, the right listener. If you tune into that silence between thunder and wind, you might hear what they heard on that night in 1968. You might feel it listening back. You've just heard another file from Echoes of the Unknown. If you want to hear what history tried to forget, subscribe and listen carefully.